The horse was worth nothing. That's what everyone in the dusty little town of Redemption agreed on. They watched from behind parted curtains and shadowed doorways as the widow, Eliza May, led the limping animal down the main street. 3 long days she'd been trying to sell it. 3 days and not a single soul had even made an offer. The vet had taken one look and just shook his head, said the infection in its leg was deep, the bone was probably tainted, the animal was barely good for the glue factory. It was a sad sight, a broken down creature at the end of its road. But then a drifter named Boone Carter, a man with dust in his clothes and not much else, pulled his very last coin from his pocket. It wasn't much, barely enough for a hot meal, but it was all he had. And as he held it out, something in Eliza May's expression changed. It wasn't relief, it wasn't gratitude. It was pure, undiluted fear. From across the street, a shopkeeper named Virgil Granger poked his head out. "You don't want that one, mister," he called out, but his voice was tight, urgent. It was loud enough that a few other folks turned to stare, their faces suddenly pale and worried. It wasn't a friendly warning, it was a plea. "Why not?" Boone asked, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't looking at Virgil. He was looking at the horse's flank. It was a mess of scarred tissue. Old brands, long healed over, had been deliberately burned over with new ones. Not once, but twice. Someone had spent a lot of time and a lot of money making absolutely sure no one could ever identify this animal's original markings. That kind of effort wasn't for a worthless horse. Eliza's hands were shaking so bad she could barely take the coin. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, just don't ask any questions. Don't ask where he came from." Now this was strange. In the 3 years since her husband had passed, Eliza May had become the town's open book. She'd tell you her business whether you asked or not. But now, she wouldn't meet Boone's eyes. She kept darting nervous glances toward the distant hills, as if she expected the devil himself to come riding down and put a stop to this whole transaction. It was like she was trying to get rid of a ticking bomb before it exploded. "Ma'am, I'm just buying a horse," Boone said, trying to gentle his voice. She finally looked at him, and her eyes were filled with a terror so profound it made his stomach clench. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're buying a lot more trouble than you know." The coin dropped into her palm, and in that exact instant, Virgil Granger yanked his head back inside and pulled his curtain shut. Across the street, 2 men who had been lounging on a bench suddenly stood up and walked away in opposite directions, like they had urgent business to attend to. A woman sweeping her porch dropped her broom and hurried inside, slamming the door. In the span of 5 seconds, the street went from quiet to dead silent. Eliza May didn't say another word. She just turned and practically ran, leaving Boone standing alone in the oppressive quiet, holding the lead rope of his new purchase. A cold certainty began to creep up his spine. Everyone in this town knew something about this horse, and whatever it was, it scared them half to death. He looked down at the broken animal, then back at the empty street. Why was an entire town so afraid of one lame horse? And what kind of secret was so terrible that it needed to be hidden behind forged brands and nervous, terrified lies? The sun was climbing, casting long skeletal shadows across the empty corral as Boone got a closer look at his purchase. The horse just stood there, quiet as a stone, favoring its left hind leg. But there was something in the way it held itself, a kind of coiled endurance that spoke of strength, not defeat. This wasn't an animal that had given up, not even close. Someone had cared for this horse, and cared for it well. You could see it in the muscle tone hidden beneath the rough, dusty coat. Boone ran his weathered hands down the horse's powerful neck, feeling the knots of tension in its shoulders. He was a man who knew horses, and this one was built for distance, for hardship. This was a survivor. He bent down to examine the brands again. 3 of them, layered one on top of the other. The work was professional, done with a steady hand and expensive irons. It was meticulous. You don't spend that kind of money just to hide a stolen nag. This was something else entirely. This was an erasure. Someone wanted this horse to cease to exist, to become a ghost with no past. "Easy there, boy," Boone murmured as the animal shifted, its body trembling slightly. Its ears weren't drooping in pain. They were swiveling, constantly, catching every little sound from the town. The snap of a twig, the distant bark of a dog. It was listening for something. It was expecting pursuit. Then Boone looked at the leg. The infection was real, no doubt about it. The skin was hot and swollen, but it wasn't nearly as bad as the vet had made it out to be. Boone had seen worse, treated worse on his own animals back when he had a ranch to call his own. A good cleaning, some poultice, a month of rest. This horse would be sound again. It would be strong. So why had Eliza been so desperate to sell it for a single coin? Why act like it was on death's door? It was a lie. The whole town was in on it. Across the way, a woman named Coraline was sweeping her porch with a frantic energy, kicking up clouds of dust. She kept stealing little glances at him, and whenever their eyes met, she'd whip her head away and go back to sweeping dirt that was already gone. Then she rushed inside, the slam of her door echoing in the silence. It was the kind of behavior Boone had seen before, in border towns right before a raid. It was the way people acted when they knew something violent was headed their way, and they wanted no part of it. Boone led the horse toward the small, rickety shelter behind the boarding house where he was staying. The animal followed him willingly, but its head kept turning, scanning the low hills that ringed the valley. It wasn't just nervous. It was searching. It was looking for landmarks it recognized. "What's your real name, boy?" Boone asked softly, his fingers tracing the scarred flesh of the brands. It was like trying to read a burned book. "And who wants you found so badly they went to all this trouble?" As he was tying the horse in the makeshift stall, he noticed something in the dirt. Fresh scratches along the fence posts, deep gouges like they were made by the claws of a big dog, or maybe a wolf. But next to them were boot prints, several sets. Not old either, made in the last day or two. Someone had been here, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the horse let out a soft whinny and pressed its body hard against the fence. Its eyes were wide, fixed on something over Boone's shoulder. Boone turned, and his blood went cold. On the horizon, a plume of dust was rising against the clear blue sky. It was small, but it was growing fast. 3 riders, and they were moving at a dead gallop, straight for the town. The horse's breathing turned ragged. Flecks of foam appeared at the corners of its mouth. This wasn't from pain. It was from pure animal terror. Whatever was coming, this horse knew it. It had seen them before. And from the way its whole body was shaking, trembling against the rails like a leaf in a storm, those riders weren't coming to talk. Boone squinted, his hand shading his eyes. The dust cloud grew, resolving into 3 distinct figures. The horse beside him had gone rigid, every muscle locked tight as a drum, ready to bolt into oblivion. The town's fear, Eliza's desperation, the fake injury. It all snapped into focus. After 3 days of nervous waiting, someone was finally coming to collect their property. But as Boone watched them ride closer, a new, more chilling question formed in his mind. Why had Eliza been so terrified to let that happen? What had this horse done or seen that made its return to its owner a fate worse than death? The 3 riders didn't slow as they hit the edge of town. They rode in like they owned the ground beneath their horses' hooves. Boone flattened himself behind the corner of the boarding house, peering around the edge. They pulled up in a cloud of dust right in front of Virgil Granger's store. Their spurs chimed like funeral bells as they swung down from their saddles. The man in the lead was tall, with silvering temples and clothes that looked like they cost more than Boone's entire life savings. He moved with a quiet confidence that radiated danger. His 2 companions were a different breed. Hard-faced men, built like brick outhouses, who flanked him with the practiced ease of hired guns. They didn't look around. Their eyes were fixed forward, scanning for threats. "Virgil," the tall man called out, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to talk." Boone could see Virgil through the storefront window. The shopkeeper's face went white as a sheet. He came out slowly, wiping his hands on his apron over and over, a nervous, twitching motion. "Mr. Dalton," Virgil stammered, his voice so thin it barely carried across the street, didn't expect you back so soon." "I'm looking for something that belongs to me," Dalton replied. His tone was polite, but it was the kind of politeness that promised extreme violence if it wasn't met with immediate cooperation. "A horse!" Gelding, about 15 hands high, has a distinctive white blaze down its face. Last seen in this area. Behind Boone, the horse started pacing in frantic, tight circles, its injured leg completely forgotten. Sweat was darkening its coat, even in the cool morning air. It knew that voice. "Haven't seen any horse like that, Mr. Dalton," Virgil said, but his eyes betrayed him. They flickered just for a second toward the boarding house. It was a tiny movement, but Dalton didn't miss it. "You might want to check with the widow, May," Virgil added quickly, trying to cover his mistake. "She's been trying to sell some old nag for days." Dalton smiled. It was a chilling, razor-thin smile that held no warmth at all. "Already spoke with Eliza," he said softly. "Had a very interesting conversation. Seems she sold her animal yesterday. Sold it to some drifter staying right here at the boarding house." Boone's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't a random search. They had tracked the horse here. They were professionals. And Eliza, poor, terrified Eliza, had already given him up. She'd probably had no choice. "Now, Virgil," Dalton continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the trembling shopkeeper. "You wouldn't happen to know where this drifter might be, would you?" The horse behind Boone let out another soft, desperate whinny. It was a sound of pure warning, a plea. It raised the hair on Boone's neck. He took a closer look at Dalton's men. Their guns were clean, well-oiled. Their posture was relaxed but ready. But it was their eyes that told the real story. They had a dead, hard flatness to them. The eyes of men who had seen and done things that would make a normal person's soul shrivel up and die. These weren't just ranch hands. They were killers. Virgil Granger's resolve crumbled. He raised a shaking hand and pointed. A trembling, bony finger aimed directly at the boarding house. I believe he's staying right there." Dalton's smile widened. He tipped the brim of his expensive hat. "Much obliged, Virgil. Always a pleasure doing business with reasonable folks." As the three men turned and started walking toward the boarding house, Boone knew he was out of time. He had one single coin to his name, and he had used it to buy something these men wanted badly enough to track across miles of rough territory. And from the confident, predatory way they walked, they weren't planning on buying it back. The horse pressed itself against the fence, its eyes wide with a terror that was sickening to see. It recognized these men. They weren't just riders. They were its tormentors. And now they had found it. The nightmare was about to begin all over again. Boone didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. Before their boots even hit the first step of the boarding house porch, he was moving. He slipped around the back, silent as a ghost, his worn-out boots making no sound in the soft dirt. He'd learned a long time ago there are moments to stand and fight and moments to vanish. This was a moment to vanish. The horse watched him, its intelligent eyes tracking his every move. And in those dark eyes, the raw terror was now mixed with something else, a tiny flickering spark of hope. "Easy now," Boone whispered, his hands fumbling with the makeshift halter. "We're leaving. Both of us." When men like Dalton came looking for something you owned, you didn't stand there and argue about the bill of sale. You made sure you were somewhere else entirely when they came to collect. Far, far away. The sound of heavy boots stomping on the wooden porch carried clearly in the morning air. Then Dalton's voice, still deceptively polite, but with an edge of cold steel just beneath the surface. "Looking for the gentleman who purchased a horse yesterday. We'd just like to discuss a business matter with him." Boone led the horse away, keeping low behind a line of ramshackle storage sheds that bordered the town. The animal moved more easily than he'd expected. The limp was still there, but it was less pronounced now. It was almost as if the horse was only pretending when it suited him. Someone had trained this horse, trained it for stealth. It responded to the slightest pressure of his hand, stayed utterly silent when silence was the only thing keeping them alive. They were almost at the edge of town when the first shout came from behind them. "He's not here, Mr. Dalton. Looks like he cleared out." Dalton's reply was calm, but it carried across the distance with chilling authority. "Search the area. He can't have gone far on foot with a lame horse." A grim smile touched Boone's lips. They were making a critical mistake. They assumed he'd abandoned the animal and run for his own skin. It was a logical assumption, Any sensible man would. But Boone had stopped being sensible the day he lost his ranch, his wife, everything he'd ever worked for. To men who looked and sounded a lot like Dalton, there comes a point in a man's life when running feels worse than dying. A point where you turn and face the storm, even if you know it's going to tear you apart. He guided the horse into a thick stand of cottonwood trees down by the creek. The sound of the rushing water would help cover their noise. The horse seemed to understand immediately, standing stock still as Boone peered back through the leaves, watching their back trail. "What did you do, boy?" he whispered, his hand resting on the horse's tense neck. "What did you do to make them this hungry to get you back?" The layers of brands told a story of desperation, but they didn't say why. Suddenly the horse's ears swiveled, locking onto a sound Boone couldn't yet hear. It wasn't the sound of men shouting in town. It was something else. Hoofbeats, coming fast along the creek road. From the rhythm, he guessed two riders. Dalton was splitting his men up, casting a net. Boone pulled his old rifle from its scabbard. He checked the action, made sure a round was in the chamber. He wasn't looking for a fight. He'd had enough fighting to last a lifetime. But experience had taught him that sometimes trouble doesn't care if you're looking for it. Sometimes it comes for you anyway, especially when you're holding something other people believe is theirs. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, a rhythmic pounding beat that sounded like a war drum. Boone's quiet morning had just exploded into chaos, and for a reason he couldn't quite explain, as he looked at the terrified, intelligent animal standing beside him, he found himself hoping. He was hoping those riders would give him a damn good reason to make things complicated for them, too. The first rider emerged from the trees like a wraith. He was younger than Dalton, with a lean, hungry look and the cold, watchful eyes of a wolf. His hand was already resting on the butt of his pistol as he scanned the creek bank, his gaze missing nothing. "I know you're in here," he called out, his voice laced with a lazy confidence. It was the voice of a man who had hunted down dozens of others in places just like this. "Mr. Dalton just wants to talk. No need to make this complicated." Boone didn't move a muscle. He stayed frozen behind the thick trunk of a cottonwood, one hand clamped firmly over the horse's muzzle to keep it from making a sound. The animal was trembling violently, a low growl rumbling deep in its chest. But this time the fear was different. It was mixed with something else, a raw, burning hatred. This horse knew this man. "Of course," the rider continued, letting his mount take slow, deliberate steps along the water's edge. "If you want to make this difficult, we can do it that way too. Dalton's a patient man up to a point, and I think you've reached it." Just then, the second rider appeared from upstream, moving to cut off their only path of retreat into the hills. They were professionals. They were boxing him in, tightening the noose. This was a practiced, deadly maneuver. "Got tracks here, Jed," the second man shouted, pointing down at the soft mud near the water. "Fresh ones. Can't be more than 20 minutes ahead of us." The horse beside Boone suddenly went rigid. Its head shot up, nostrils flaring. For a heart-stopping second, Boone thought it was going to let out a terrified cry, giving them away. But it didn't. Instead, it did something so unexpected, so utterly bizarre, that it took Boone's breath away. It took a single, deliberate step forward, moving out from behind the tree. It placed its own body between Boone and the two approaching riders. The movement was quiet, subtle, but it was charged with unmistakable intent. It was an act of protection. This wasn't just a scared animal running for its life. This was a partner. This was a soldier. "Well, well," the first rider Jed said, a slow, cruel grin spreading across his face as he spotted them through the trees. "There you are." Boone stepped out from behind the cottonwood. He held his rifle at his side, not aiming it, but ready. "Morning, gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Beautiful day for a ride." "Indeed it is," Jed replied, his grin never wavering. "Mr. Dalton sent us to extend a personal invitation. He'd like to discuss the purchase you made yesterday." "Horse isn't for sale," Boone said flatly. The second rider urged his mount closer, his hand now gripping his own pistol. "See, that's where you're mistaken," he sneered. "That animal never belonged to the widow in the first place. She was just holding it for us." And just like that, another piece of the puzzle slammed into place. Eliza May hadn't been selling her horse. She had been trying to get rid of something dangerous that had been forced on her. She hadn't been trying to make a profit. She'd been trying to survive. She hadn't sold Boone a horse. She had handed him a death sentence to save herself. That's an interesting story, Boone said, stalling for time, his mind racing. Mind if I ask what makes you so certain? Jed's hand moved, his fingers wrapping around the handle of his gun. The brand tells the whole tale, friend. That's Dalton Ranch property, bought and paid for. But as Boone glanced at his own horse, he saw something the riders couldn't. The animal was no longer trembling. Its ears were pricked forward. Its posture was alert, coiled, ready. It was waiting for a command. It was waiting for a signal to either run or to fight. The standoff hung in the air for 3 long, silent heartbeats. Then the horse made the decision for all of them. With no warning, no sound, it lunged. Not away, but forward. It launched itself at Jed's mount, teeth bared in a silent, vicious snarl, its front hooves lashing out like battering rams. Jed's horse screamed in terror and reared violently, throwing its rider backward into the shallow creek with a huge splash. "Control that animal!" the second rider roared, fumbling to draw his weapon. But Boone was already in motion. He used the explosion of chaos as cover. He grabbed the horse's lead rope and in one fluid movement vaulted onto its bare back. He felt a jolt of pain from the horse's injured leg as it took his weight, but the animal didn't even flinch. "That's Dalton's property," Jed sputtered from the creek, water streaming from his face as he scrambled for his dropped pistol. "Then Dalton should have taken better care of it," Boone yelled back, wheeling the horse around and kicking it into a gallop, heading for the open country beyond the creek. What happened next was even more shocking than the attack. The horse didn't flee in a blind panic. It moved with the smooth, calculated precision of a warhorse. It anticipated Boone's commands before he even gave them, responding to the slightest shift of his weight, the barest pressure of his knees. It navigated the treacherous, rock-strewn terrain with an expert sureness that could only have come from years of rigorous, professional training. This wasn't a ranch horse. This was a cavalry mount. The second rider gave chase, spurring his own horse mercilessly, but he couldn't keep up. His mount struggled on the broken ground, slipping and stumbling. But Boone's horse seemed to know every dip, every hidden game trail, every safe path through the rocks. It was like it had run this exact route 100 times before. "This isn't over," the rider screamed after them, his voice already growing faint with distance. They crested a low ridge, and Boone felt the horse's gait suddenly change. It smoothed out, became longer, more powerful. He looked down. The limp was gone, completely gone. It had been replaced by the effortless, ground-eating stride of an animal in its prime. The infection, the weakness, the staggering, all of it. It had been a lie, an act, an elaborate, brilliant performance. "You've been playing sick," Boone said aloud, a slow grin of grudging admiration spreading across his face. "You clever devil. It was all a strategy. You made everyone think you weren't worth the trouble." The horse's ears flicked back, acknowledging his voice. They rode hard for another mile before Boone finally pulled the animal to a halt in a hidden grove of ancient oak trees. From this vantage point, he could see the entire valley laid out below him. The town, the creek, and something else. Another dust cloud approaching from the south. But this one was bigger. Much bigger. At least a dozen riders. "Dalton's bringing reinforcements," Boone murmured, his hand resting on the horse's neck. "Whatever makes you so special, he's not giving up. Not now, not ever." But as he watched them, a troubling, chilling realization began to form. The riders weren't coming from the direction of Dalton's ranch. They were coming from the east, from the direction of the territorial capital. And they weren't riding like a posse. They were riding in a tight, organized formation, the formation of lawmen or soldiers. Either Dalton had the kind of power that could summon the law on a whim, or this horse wasn't just stolen property. It was something far more important. It was evidence. "What did you see, boy?" Boone asked the horse, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you know that's worth bringing the whole territory into it?" The horse didn't look at him. It turned its head, its gaze fixed on a distant, solitary mountain peak that clawed at the sky. Its ears pricked forward with an unmistakable, urgent recognition. Somewhere up on that mountain, there were answers. Answers men were willing to kill for, to burn brands over, to lie for. And as Boone stared at that remote peak, he was beginning to suspect that finding those answers was the only way either of them were going to get out of this alive. The abandoned cabin was exactly where the horse had been looking. It was tucked away at the base of the peak, nearly swallowed by years of unchecked forest growth, but the bones of it were still good. The horse had led him there with the unerring certainty of a creature returning home, picking its way along trails so faint they were little more than memories in the dirt. "You've been here before," Boone said, swinging down from the horse's back. He ran a hand over the weathered log walls. "This was your place." Inside, the single room was thick with the dust of ages. Motes danced in the pale shafts of sunlight that pierced the gloom through gaps in the wooden shutters. But underneath the thick layer of dust, there were signs of recent life. A cold fire pit held the gray ghosts of ashes. A stack of blankets on a crude cot were folded with crisp military precision. And sitting on a rough-hewn table in the center of the room was a leather saddlebag. It hadn't gathered nearly enough dust. It had been left here only recently. Boone's heart started to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He crossed the room and opened the bag. His blood ran cold. Inside were official documents, stamped with the seal of the territorial government, land surveys, mining claims, geological reports, and beneath them all, a thick stack of personal letters that felt heavy as lead in his hands. The letters were addressed to a Captain James Morrison of the Territorial Survey Division. The most recent one was dated just 2 weeks ago, and it was written in a familiar, elegant script. It was Dalton's handwriting. Boone read the last letter, his hands starting to shake. "Morrison has become unreliable," it said. "His newfound conscience is interfering with our arrangement. The survey maps he's provided show mineral deposits that could make us all wealthy beyond measure. But he is now threatening to report our private claims to the territorial authorities. He has to be silenced. We need to discuss permanent, alternative arrangements." Boone set the letter down on the dusty table, his fingers numb. Captain James Morrison, a military surveyor. A man who had discovered something immensely valuable out here in the wilderness. Gold, silver, something worth killing for. A man who had lived in this very cabin with his horse, his partner. He'd been conducting official government surveys, but secretly, he'd been feeding information to Dalton and his cronies. But then it seemed Morrison's conscience had kicked in. He was going to blow the whistle, and Dalton had arranged for him to be silenced. Permanently. From outside, the horse let out a soft, low whinny. It wasn't a sound of greeting, it was a warning. Boone moved to the grimy window, peering through a crack in the shutters. Far below on the winding mountain trail, he saw them. Riders, a lot of them. Too many for a simple recovery mission. Dalton and his men, and the posse from the capital, all converging on this exact spot. "They found us," he breathed. He turned back to the documents scattered on the table. This wasn't just a horse theft anymore. This was murder. These papers weren't just letters. They were a confession. They were evidence that could hang a man like Dalton, no matter how rich or powerful he was. And Dalton knew it. He would go to any lengths to get these papers back and bury them forever. Boone grabbed the most damning of the letters and stuffed them inside his shirt. He looked around the cabin, his eyes landing on the rear window. It was small but big enough for a man to squeeze through. He went to it, and when he looked out, the horse was already there, waiting patiently, its intelligent eyes fixed on him. It had seen this kind of danger before with its previous owner. It knew the drill. "Morrison trained you well, boy," Boone said, swinging a leg through the window and dropping lightly onto the horse's back. "Real question is, did he teach you where he hid the real survey maps?" As if in answer, the horse turned its head, not down the mountain toward escape, but up, toward a narrow, treacherous-looking canyon that cut deep into the rock face above them. A place no posse would ever think to look. Hidden up there, in those rocky heights, was the truth. The truth about Captain Morrison's death and the treasure that had cost him his life. But the riders below were climbing fast. their voices carrying on the thin mountain air. Boone knew with a sudden, chilling certainty that reaching that canyon alive would take every ounce of skill, courage, and luck that both he and this remarkable horse possessed. The final chase had begun, and this time, there would be no place left to run. The canyon ended abruptly in a sheer, impassable wall of granite. It was a dead end, a perfect trap, but the horse didn't even slow down. It veered to the left and stepped onto a narrow, crumbling ledge that Boone would have sworn couldn't even support a goat. It followed a path that seemed to exist only in its memory, a secret way known only to the horse and its murdered master. Behind them, the shouts of Dalton's men echoed off the stone walls. They were trapped below, their own horses unable to handle the treacherous terrain. "He's up there! Box him in!" Dalton's voice roared, filled with fury and frustration. "Easy now," Boone murmured, leaning low over the horse's neck, feeling the powerful muscles bunch and strain with every careful step. The drop to their right was hundreds of feet straight down. One wrong move, one slip, and it was all over. Every step they took was a gamble, taking them further into the trap, but also closer to whatever secret Morrison had died to protect. The ledge suddenly widened, opening onto a small hidden plateau. And there, cut into the mountainside, was the dark, gaping mouth of an old, abandoned mining shaft. Fresh tool marks around the entrance, new scratches on the rock, told Boone that someone had been here very, very recently. Morrison. He had been working here, clearing debris from the tunnel. Boone slid off the horse's back and approached the shaft, his rifle held ready. The air coming from the mine was cold and smelled of damp earth and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet. He pulled a match from his pocket, struck it, and stepped inside. Just a few feet into the tunnel, protected from the elements by a large sheet of oiled canvas, lay Captain Morrison's real survey equipment, his transit, his chains, his geological hammers, and his maps. Not the fakes he'd given to Dalton, but the real ones. A detailed, meticulous geological survey of the entire mountain range. And marked on it, in Morrison's precise hand, was a discovery that made Boone's jaw drop. It wasn't gold, it was silver. A vein of pure silver so rich and vast, it could single-handedly fund the territory's expansion for the next 50 years. It was a fortune beyond imagining. "You clever man, Morrison," Boone whispered to the empty tunnel. "You were playing them the whole time." He gave Dalton false maps leading to worthless claims, all while keeping the real prize for himself, or perhaps for the government he served. The sound of boots scraping on stone from outside snapped him back to the present. Their pursuers had found a way up. Boone spun around, emerging from the mine just as Dalton himself scrambled onto the plateau, flanked by four of his hardest-looking men. The wealthy rancher was panting from the climb, his expensive clothes torn and filthy, but his eyes burned with the cold, triumphant satisfaction of a hunter who has finally cornered his prey. "End of the trail, Drifter," Dalton said, pulling his pistol, the motion smooth and practiced. "I'll take those documents now, and whatever else Morrison hid up here." Boone stood his ground, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. "These documents prove you murdered Captain Morrison," he said, his voice ringing with cold accusation. "That's a hanging offense, Dalton, even for a man with your connections." Dalton laughed. It was a dead, ugly sound that didn't have a trace of humor in it. Morrison was a government deserter who stole territorial property. That's the official story. No one's going to investigate too hard when we find his body in this mine shaft. Right alongside yours. Dalton raised his pistol, taking careful aim at Boone's chest. But as he did, the horse moved. With that same shocking, calculated intelligence it had shown at the creek, it stepped sideways. In one fluid movement, it placed its body directly between Dalton's gun and Boone. It became a living shield. And then it lifted its head and let out a single, piercing, impossibly loud whinny that echoed through the canyon like a trumpet blast. "Shoot that damn animal!" Dalton screamed at his men. But the sound that answered wasn't a gunshot. It was another sound, a familiar one, coming from down the trail. The distinctive, sharp whistle of a territorial marshal signaling his men. Dalton froze. He spun around to see a man in a dusty coat with a silver star pinned to his chest, climbing onto the plateau. followed by a full company of armed deputies. Someone in town, maybe Virgil, maybe even Eliza, had finally decided that Dalton's brand of terror had gone too far. They had sent for the law. "Marshal Bradley," Dalton gasped, his face draining of all color, his confidence shattering like glass. "What? What brings you all the way up here?" The marshal dismounted, his eyes as hard and cold as the mountain rock. "Murder investigation, Dalton," he said, his voice booming in the enclosed space. "Captain Morrison's disappearance has attracted some very important attention from the territorial capital. Seems someone's been falsifying mineral surveys and removing federal officers. Permanently." Boone held up the stack of letters he'd taken from the cabin. "Everything you need is right here, Marshal," he said, his voice clear and strong, "including Dalton's confession to murder, written in his own hand." The final pieces of the puzzle were slamming into place, and this time, they weren't forming a picture of fear and corruption. They were forming a picture of justice. Marshal Bradley took the letters from Boone and read through them with the slow, methodical focus of a man who knows he holds a killer's fate in his hands. He read Dalton's own words describing his plan to silence Captain Morrison, his greed laid bare on the page. "Dalton," Bradley said, finally looking up, his face set like granite, "you're under arrest for the murder of Captain James Morrison and for conspiracy to defraud the territorial government." He nodded to his deputies who moved in, their own guns now drawn. Dalton's face had gone the color of old ash. "You can't prove I killed anyone," he rasped, his voice a pathetic shadow of its former authority. "Those documents, they could be forgeries." "Maybe," Bradley agreed, a cold glint in his eye. "But I have a feeling Captain Morrison's body is in that mine shaft, exactly where your letter says it would be. And these geological surveys you were using," he said, gesturing to the false maps one of Dalton's men was carrying, "don't match the official records Morrison filed with the Capitol right before he vanished. He left a breadcrumb trail, Dalton. He knew you were coming for him, and he made sure you'd never get away with it. I'd say that's more than enough for a jury." As the deputies hauled the sputtering, defeated Dalton and his men away in shackles, leading them back down the treacherous mountain trail, Marshal Bradley turned to Boone. There was a look of genuine curiosity, of respect in the lawman's eyes. "I have to ask," he said, "what made you risk your neck like this, for a horse you'd only owned for a day?" Boone looked at the magnificent animal standing beside him. It was calm now, the terror gone from its eyes, replaced by a quiet dignity. He reached out and stroked its powerful neck. "Sometimes a man reaches a point where running feels worse than fighting," he said softly. "This horse, he belonged to a man who died trying to do the right thing. It just seemed fitting to finish what he started." "Well, the territorial government owes you a great debt," Bradley said. "These real maps you found will prevent thousands of acres of public land from falling into the hands of criminals. There's a substantial reward for this kind of information." Boone thought for a moment. He thought of the terrified look in Eliza May's eyes. "Give it to the widow, Eliza May," he said. "She took one hell of a risk selling me this horse instead of just handing it over to Dalton's men. A woman like that deserves better than a life spent in fear." Bradley nodded, a slow smile of approval spreading across his face. "I'll see to it personally," he promised. "What about the horse?" "Morrison trained him for cavalry work. He'd make an excellent addition to the territorial service." But even as the marshal spoke, Boone was shaking his head. He looked into the horse's dark, intelligent eyes and saw a fellow survivor, a partner who had fought alongside him. "No," Boone said, his voice firm. "This horse has earned his freedom, more than any of us. He's coming with me." 3 weeks later, Boone Carter rode into a green, peaceful valley he'd never seen before. He was leading a pack animal loaded down with supplies, paid for with a small portion of the reward money the marshal had insisted he take. The horse beneath him, the one the world had deemed worthless, moved with the proud, easy confidence of an animal that had finally come home. Together, they built a small ranch. It wasn't much, just a sturdy cabin and a solid corral. But it was theirs. It was honest work, and it suited them both. The horse, who Boone now simply called Captain, had fully recovered from his long-feigned injury and proved to be the smartest, most reliable partner a man could ask for. Sometimes in the quiet of the evening, When the day's work was done, Boone would see Captain standing by the fence line, looking out toward the distant mountains where his first master rested. There was no sadness in the animal's posture anymore, only a deep, quiet satisfaction, a duty completed, a promise kept, justice served. Dalton was hanged for the murder of Captain Morrison after a trial that took all of 3 days. His criminal empire crumbled overnight as the authorities seized his assets and used Morrison's real maps to redistribute the land claims to honest settlers. Boone Carter had spent his last coin on a broken horse that nobody wanted, and in return he had been given back something far more valuable than silver or gold. He had been given a second chance, the chance to rebuild a life with his honor intact and a loyal partner who understood, better than any human, the true meaning of courage. And in the end, that was more than enough. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and justice collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories just like this one. Your support means the world to us.